Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening or watching from. We'd love to hear from our fellow mystery lovers around the world. Miss Marple and a Dose of Silence. Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Village Whispers. The train to Chesham Vale puffed gently across the countryside, the low hum of conversation mingling with the clatter of wheels on rail. It was the kind of journey that appealed to Miss Marple, unhurried, with ample time to observe one's fellow passengers and let the countryside's rhythm lull one into pleasant speculation. She was visiting an old friend, Mrs. Edith Cranton, who had recently sprained her ankle in an unfortunate but unsurprising incident involving a slippery doormat and a rather energetic terrier named Pickle. The village itself, tucked amid gentle hills and embroidered with hawthorn hedges, looked like something out of a biscuit tin. Neat brick cottages stood in rows, their gardens bursting with marigolds, foxgloves, and the occasional unruly gooseberry bush. But beneath that charming veneer, Miss Marple suspected, there always lurked human nature, unpredictable, passionate, often foolish. It was barely an hour after she had arrived at Edith's ivy-clad house when the first whisper of death reached her. The housekeeper, Clara, never one to keep her voice down, was discussing the tragedy with the milkman just outside the sitting-room window, quite unaware of the open sash. "Such a pretty girl, too," Clara was saying. "And clever." Nurse Ellis, they called her, found dead in her own cottage just yesterday morning. Fell and hit her head, they say, but the doctor looked troubled when he left, mark my words. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Clara continued, "And that boy, Stephen Ray, she was always seen walking with him, wasn't she?" Bit rough round the edges, that one, not what her family would have liked at all. Edith, lying back with her foot propped on cushions, gave a soft sigh. "Poor Maureen Ellis, I remember her as a child, Jean Ellis's youngest. Always so proper, even with skinned knees. A bit serious for her age. She trained as a nurse in Reading, then came back to look after old Mr. Partridge before joining the village clinic. She was only 23, Jane," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, her mind already whirring. Accidents did happen, certainly, but rarely without a cause, and even more rarely without context. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accompanied Edith on a slow amble through the village lanes, Edith leaning on her cane, Miss Marple on her arm. Their stroll was punctuated by gentle nods and half-whispered greetings from villagers, many of whom looked over their shoulders as if they too sensed something was not quite right. "Stephen Ray used to deliver vegetables to the school when I was headmistress," Edith remarked suddenly. "His family lives near the lower fields, the Rays of Briar Hollow. His father had some troubles in the past, something with the bank, terribly scandalous at the time." "And this Stephen was courting Miss Ellis?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Edith hesitated. "Well, they were close. I wouldn't say openly courting. Her mother was against it, I think. Jean Ellis was always terribly proud of her side of the family. The Rays were not considered quite good enough." Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Family pride. Village histories were like spider webs. One needed only the right beam of light to see how everything was connected. They passed the village green, where a small knot of women were gathered near the post office. Their conversation paused mid-sentence at the sight of Miss Marple and Edith. A younger woman, perhaps in her late 30s, broke from the group and approached. "Mrs. Cranton, how lovely to see you out. And you must be Miss Marple," she said warmly. "I'm Frances Hargreaves, Maureen's matron at the clinic." Miss Marple shook her hand gently. "We're all still in shock," Frances said, her voice catching. "Maureen was such a steady girl, always on time, always kept her records properly. The patients trusted her." "And you found her?" Miss Marple asked, as delicately as she could. No, it was her landlady, Mrs. Broom, said she didn't hear her leave in the morning, which was unusual. Found her lying near the hearth rug. Must have slipped and hit her head on the corner of the stove. There was a bit of bleeding, poor thing. It looked like an accident, though I don't believe they've ruled anything definitively yet." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Had she been unwell recently, or perhaps anxious?" Frances glanced away. She had worries, I suppose. Her family disapproved of her friendship with Stephen Ray. That sort of thing takes its toll. "Did she talk about it?" Miss Marple asked. Frances paused. "Not directly. She was quiet, very private. But her eyes looked different the past few weeks. Heavy, as if she hadn't slept." Edith shifted uncomfortably, perhaps aware that they were lingering too long on painful ground. Miss Marple offered kind thanks, and the ladies resumed their walk. That evening, as Clara brought in tea, she added her own tidbit of gossip without prompting. Dr. Redcliffe didn't say much when he left the cottage, just that he needed to notify the coroner, but I saw the inspector's face. He looked bothered. "And Stephen Ray's gone into hiding or off drinking, depending on who you ask." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Oh, yes," Clara nodded sagely. "And someone said she posted a letter the night before. Looked urgent. Wonder who it was for." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. The pattern was already forming. A troubled romance, a proud family, a respected girl with tired eyes, and a village full of secrets. She looked out the window at the lamp-lit lane and the shadows that stretched just beyond it. "Sometimes," she said softly to Edith, "an accident is just an accident. But more often than not, it's a little bit of planning that didn't quite go as intended." Chapter 2. A kind girl, but stubborn. It was the morning after her arrival in Chesham Vale when Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Edith Cranton to the modest stone church at the village's edge. The sun filtered gently through stained glass, splashing soft colour onto the pews. A subdued hush hung in the air. Though it wasn't a formal funeral, the vicar had agreed to say a few words for Nurse Maureen Ellis during the Sunday service. "A quiet tribute to a good soul," he had said. Miss Marple sat near the rear, observing with unobtrusive attention. The Ellis family was present. Maureen's widowed mother, Jean, sat rigidly between her eldest daughter, Lillian, and a sombre-looking cousin. Jean's mouth was tight with grief, but not a tear fell. She wore black gloves and a hat so stiff and wide-brimmed it was more a shield than an accessory. Her eyes avoided every pair of eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple made note of that. Grief, in her experience, came in all shades, but this had the icy hue of bitterness. Behind them, 2 young nurses from the local clinic whispered together, one wiping her nose with a handkerchief. Several villagers attended as well. Mrs. Broom, the landlady, sat alone and seemed genuinely distressed. The village chemist, Mr. Collis, arrived late and stood awkwardly at the back, his eyes darting as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The service was brief, a hymn, a prayer, and a soft-spoken homily from Reverend Elston, who described Maureen as diligent, dutiful, and reserved. Words that meant little to strangers, but everything to those who paid attention. Outside the church, Miss Marple watched the mourners trickle away in 2s and 3s, conversations taking root in clusters like mushrooms after rain. She and Edith paused near the lich gate when Matron Frances Hargreaves appeared once more. "She never missed a Sunday," Frances said with a soft, tired smile. "Maureen, I mean. Not that she was especially devout, but she respected order. I think it gave her a sense of stability." "Stability in the face of what, do you think?" Miss Marple asked gently. Frances tilted her head. Her life wasn't as calm as she let on. There was a stubborn streak in her. Lovely girl, but once her mind was made up. She paused. Her mother had plans, wanted Maureen to work at the private hospital in Tunbridge Wells. Better class of patients, but Maureen refused. She wanted to stay in Chesham Vale? Miss Marple asked. Frances hesitated. Yes and no, she said the village needed her, but I sometimes thought she stayed because of Stephen. Stephen Ray? A shadow flickered across the matron's face. Yes, that boy's name causes no small amount of tension. Mrs. Ellis didn't approve, nor did her sister. And I don't think Stephen helped his case much. He's, impulsive, proud too, a little like Maureen in that way. Stubbornness often runs both ways, Miss Marple observed mildly. Were they still together? They argued a few times. I know because she came in once with a bruise on her wrist, said she caught it on the garden gate. Frances looked away, troubled. I never believed that, but she wouldn't say more. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Did anyone else notice? Frances shook her head. If they did, no one said, and that's the way of villages, isn't it? We notice, but we pretend we don't. It's safer. They were interrupted by the arrival of the pharmacist, Mr. Collis, a wiry man with a thick moustache and a permanent air of discomfort. He nodded to Frances and tried to hurry past, but Miss Marple turned just slightly in his path. Mr. Collis, I don't believe we've met properly. Jane Marple. He blinked, flustered, and bowed slightly. Ah, Miss Marple. Yes, yes. Sad business, very sad. I knew Nurse Ellis, of course. She sometimes collected prescriptions for her patients. She was rather conscientious, wasn't she? Miss Marple said pleasantly. Oh, yes. Quite strict about dosages, asked lots of questions, took notes. Did she ever collect anything unusual recently? Mr. Collis gave a startled blink. Unusual? Miss Marple tilted her head. Sedatives? Chloral hydrate? Phenobarbital, perhaps? He looked around nervously. Well, yes, I suppose. She collected a small bottle of chloral hydrate about a month ago. Prescription was written by Dr. Redcliffe, for one of her patients, I assumed. And she didn't mention the patient's name? No, confidentiality, you see. She was always careful with that. He glanced behind him. If you'll excuse me. He left in a near scuttle. Miss Marple watched him disappear around the churchyard's edge, her brows knitting in thought. Edith, leaning on her stick beside her, murmured, He looks guilty of something. He may be, Miss Marple replied. But the question is, of what? They continued their walk home slowly. Along the lane they passed the Ellis home, a prim two-story house with lace curtains and precisely trimmed shrubs. The curtains in the front window fluttered. Miss Marple was certain she saw Lillian Ellis watching them. Back at the house, Clara served tea and offered a fresh titbit of news. Mrs. Broom, the landlady, says Maureen was writing letters late into the night that last week, burned one of them in the hearth, left another out, half finished, and there was a torn envelope with Stephen Ray's name on it. She swears someone came back after the body was removed and took it. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. And the drawer? Still locked. Police haven't pried it open. Not yet. Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. People can be careless with hearts, Clara, but they are rarely careless with secrets. That night, while Edith read her mystery novel and Pickle snored underfoot, Miss Marple sat near the sitting-room fire, her mind quietly ticking. A bruise denied, a sedative obtained, a letter written and then destroyed, a stubborn girl, proud and perhaps frightened, and a young man, volatile and now missing from the scene. Too many little details, she thought, for so simple a tragedy. And in Miss Marple's experience, when the village began whispering about a dead girl's accident, it usually meant someone hoped the whispers would drown out the truth. Chapter 3. The family in denial. By Tuesday morning, the village of Chesham Vale had resumed its usual routine. Children marched off to school with satchels swinging, the baker's bell chimed in the distance, and hens clucked behind neatly clipped hedges. But underneath that everyday calm, a certain unease had begun to take root. Miss Marple noticed it in the way conversations paused when she passed, and in the glances flicked towards the Ellis home whenever the name Maureen surfaced in a hushed exchange. It was Edith Cranton who suggested that Miss Marple accompany her on a visit to the Ellis family. "We might drop by with scones and a jar of quince jelly," she said. "It's the neighbourly thing to do, and Jean does so love to talk, once you let her." Miss Marple agreed. She had no great interest in the scones or the jelly, but she had every interest in observing the household of the young woman now lying buried beneath fresh soil and forget-me-nots. The Ellis home stood on Ashford Lane, a respectable address, with a view of the chapel steeple and just enough garden to suggest modest pride. The front door was opened by Lillian, Maureen's elder sister, a woman with angular features and tightly set lips. She glanced at the basket of scones, but did not smile. "Mummy's upstairs," she said. "Would you like to come in?" They were shown into the parlour, where lace antimacassars perched on every armchair, and the scent of lavender hung faintly in the air. A family photograph sat on the mantelpiece. Mr. Ellis, long dead, looking stern, Jean in a broad hat, Lillian stiff-backed, and Maureen slightly apart, eyes downcast, as though already carrying secrets. Jean Ellis entered a few moments later. Her face was pale but not tear-streaked, and her composure was perfect to the point of unnaturalness. She wore mourning black and carried a small handkerchief she never used. "Jane Marple," she said with a thin smile. "I remember you from a garden party in St. Mary Mead." "You made the most splendid lemon cake," Miss Marple returned the smile. "That would have been for Mrs. Lumley's niece's engagement, and your scones were quite admired too, if I recall." Jean inclined her head but said nothing more on the topic. She sat and folded her hands in her lap. "We were terribly sorry to hear about Maureen," Edith said gently. "We thought it proper to call and pay our respects." Jean nodded. "She was a good girl, headstrong, yes, but diligent. I tried to do my best by her. God knows I tried." Lillian looked away, her fingers twitching in her lap. Miss Marple tilted her head. "It's always a difficult balance, isn't it? Letting young people make their own mistakes, even when we see them coming." Jean's lips thinned. "You're referring to Stephen Ray, I imagine?" "I had heard mention of him." Jean gave a small huff. A vulgar, uneducated boy from a disgraced family. His father stole from the cooperative bank, and the mother, well, no one even knows if she was properly married. The Rays have always been beneath us. Maureen knew that. I told her plainly. "And did she listen?" Miss Marple asked softly. "She did," Lillian interjected quickly. "Eventually." Jean's eyes flashed, but she said nothing. Miss Marple noted the tension, sharp, brittle, long-standing. Not grief alone, but something tangled in years of rivalry and judgment. "Did they argue?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. Jean glanced at her daughter. "Once," Lillian said, too fast. 2 weeks before it happened, in the garden." "She wanted to leave," Jean said flatly. "To run away with him. Can you imagine? Throwing away her nursing career for him." "And what did you say?" Miss Marple asked, not unkindly. "I told her she could pack her things and be gone by nightfall, that no daughter of mine would disgrace our family name by aligning herself with that sort of man." There was no shame in her voice, only steel. "She came back inside crying," Lillian added in a softer tone. She said she wasn't sure anymore, Miss Marple took a sip of tea that had been poured and forgotten. It had gone cold. "And did she tell Stephen?" she asked. Jean snorted. "I wouldn't know. I never saw him again after that evening, and good riddance." Miss Marple nodded. "I was told a letter had been sent the night before Maureen died." Lillian stiffened. "That's the first I've heard of it." Posted at the village box just before midnight, the postmistress remembers, it's not often people send letters that late. Jean's expression didn't change, but her fingers clutched the hem of her dress. "Did Maureen often write letters?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes drifting to the writing bureau in the corner. "No," John said sharply. "She preferred telephone calls. Why do you ask?" "Oh, only that someone mentioned a locked drawer in her cottage," Miss Marple said, almost idly. "And I thought perhaps she might have kept a diary." "Young women often do." Lillian looked down at her lap. Jean stood abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I find these questions distasteful. My daughter is gone. I see no purpose in picking at her memory." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Of course, forgive me. I only wondered if Maureen might have had worries she couldn't share aloud." "She had everything she needed," Jean said sharply. "A roof, education, a future. If she was unhappy, she chose to be." The visit concluded soon after. On their walk home, Edith said nothing for several minutes. It was Miss Marple who finally broke the silence. "She reminds me of my cousin Geraldine," she said. "Oh?" "Yes. Geraldine once insisted her daughter marry a vicar's son rather than a pianist she loved. Said she wanted what was respectable. The girl married the vicar's son. Within 2 years, she'd drowned herself in a pond. But Geraldine still maintained she had made the right decision for the family's reputation." Edith looked stricken. "You don't think—" Miss Marple shook her head. "Number not suicide, but I do think Maureen Ellis was a prisoner in her own home, and when someone tries to escape, there are always people willing to bolt the door shut." That evening, Miss Marple wrote a discreet letter to Dr. Redcliffe requesting a quiet meeting. If Maureen had received a fatal blow, Miss Marple suspected it was not to the head, but to the heart. The rest, as always, followed. Chapter 4. The Missing Letter. The morning air was crisp with dew, and the hedgerows along Ashford Lane glistened faintly beneath the weak October sun. Miss Marple, never one to let matters stew without investigation, had arranged a polite visit with Mrs. Broom, the landlady who had discovered Maureen Ellis's body. The cottage stood at the far end of the lane, small, neat, with ivy creeping gently along its stone facade, and a squeaky garden gate that sounded like a distant cough when pushed. Mrs. Broom, a round-faced widow with observant eyes and a brisk manner, welcomed Miss Marple with more curiosity than grief. "Well now," she said, dusting her apron. "I've not had a guest for tea since this wretched business began. Come in, Miss Marple. I dare say you've heard the village version by now. Bits of it true, some of it twisted like old rope." "I prefer the truth," Miss Marple said gently as she stepped inside. The parlour was modest, but immaculate. A faded armchair beside the hearth, a table with a lace doily, and on the sideboard a small framed photograph of Maureen, standing in uniform beside a row of daffodils. She was tidy, quiet, the kind of girl who washed out her teacups before bed, Mrs. Broom said with a wistful shake of her head. Didn't laugh much, but she was kind. Always remembered my birthday, that sort of girl. Miss Marple glanced around. "May I ask, where was she found?" Mrs. Broom led her through a narrow hallway to the sitting room. The hearth sat low and squat beneath the mantel. "Right there," she said, pointing at the worn rug. Lying awkwardly, like she'd slipped coming back from the kitchen, her head hit the cast-iron edge of the grate. "Horrid thing!" Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, and noticed faint indentations on the wooden floor. 2, in particular, were deeper than the rest, just beside the hearthrug. "Furniture moved?" she asked. "Oh, yes." The constable moved the chair back when he first arrived, said he needed room to examine the wound. But I remember Miss Marple. When I found her, that chair was already tipped. "Really?" Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "I thought it was odd," Mrs. Broom said. "She was always so careful, never left a slipper out of place, but there it was, like she'd stood up too fast or someone else had." "And what about her desk?" Mrs. Broom looked over. "Oh, the little bureau, locked, still. Police said they might come back for it, but they've done little so far." Miss Marple approached the desk, noticing dust rings where items had once rested. "She kept things organized, did she?" "Always," Mrs. Broom replied. "There was a diary there. She'd write in it every night before bed. Gone now." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Gone?" "I noticed the empty space straight away," Mrs. Broom confirmed. "And there was a letter on the desk that evening, half-written. She burnt another in the hearth earlier. I saw the ashes. Fussy girl, Maureen. But she never left things undone unless something bothered her." "And this half-written letter?" "Vanished," Mrs. Broom said, a bit flatly now. "I told the officer. He said I probably imagined it. I didn't." Miss Marple nodded. "I quite believe you." They returned to the parlour, and over a modest tea of seed cake and lemon slices, Mrs. Broom shared one final observation. "The night before she died," she said, "I heard voices." Raised. "I couldn't make out words, but I'm sure there was a man's voice." "I didn't want to pry. Maureen valued her privacy, but the next morning—" Miss Marple finished her tea and patted Mrs. Broom's hand. "You've helped me immensely, and I must say you notice details just like a trained investigator." Mrs. Broom flushed with pleasure. "Well, I watched the wireless." Back in Edith Cranton's garden that afternoon, Miss Marple took a moment to reflect. It was not the first time a letter had gone missing at a crucial moment in someone's life. But 2, one posted, one left behind, suggested panic, not coincidence. She had barely settled herself with her knitting when a soft knock came at the garden gate. It was young Millie Cartwright, the postmistress's daughter, no more than 14 and shy as a hedgehog. "Miss Marple?" she said. "Mum said I should tell you what I saw about Nurse Ellis." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Come, child, would you like a biscuit?" Millie perched on the edge of the bench like a sparrow. "It was the night before Nurse Ellis died," she said in a whisper. "I'd gone to post a letter for my brother. Mum lets me do it before bed. I saw someone else there, by the postbox, Maureen Ellis." "And she was posting a letter?" "Yes, but she looked frightened. She kept checking over her shoulder like she expected someone to follow her. I said hello, but she didn't answer, just walked off quick." "Did she say where the letter was going?" "No, but she had the address written. London, I think. The envelope was cream, thick, not like the cheap ones." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did she say anything else?" "Number, but the next day Mum said the postbag felt lighter than usual, like something had been taken." "Taken?" Miss Marple asked. Millie nodded solemnly. "Mum thinks someone tampered with it, but there's no proof. It was locked when it left, but we both know the post office key's easy to lift off the hook." Miss Marple thanked her, praised her observation, and handed her a fresh jam tart for her trouble. That evening, as the golden light folded over the village rooftops, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a blank piece of paper in her lap. What she knew: a letter posted late, likely intercepted. A second letter half-written, now missing. A desk with a locked drawer, never opened. A missing diary. A tipped chair by the hearth. A sedative obtained weeks prior. And a young woman who had grown frightened too frightened to speak openly. These were not the footprints of chance. This was a trail of someone cleaning up after a hasty act. Someone clever enough to take what they thought mattered, but not quite clever enough to know what they'd left behind. Miss Marple folded the paper and reached for her knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically like a distant clock winding down. Her next visit, she decided, would be to Dr. Redcliffe. People often said dead girls could not speak, but in Miss Marple's long experience, they left behind little whispers in drawers, dust, and half-written letters, and if one listened long enough, they always told the truth. Chapter 5. A Man Too Quiet. The next morning in Chesham Vale was thick with fog, the kind that blurred shapes into suggestion and wrapped the village lanes in hushed grey. It was on just such a morning that Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Dr. Redcliffe, the village's resident physician, and by most accounts a man both respected and discreet. His surgery stood beside the green in a smart red brick house with ivy climbing toward the upstairs windows. A brass nameplate gleamed faintly beneath the knocker. Miss Marple had sent word ahead requesting only a few minutes of conversation if the doctor could spare them, and had received a courteous reply. He greeted her himself, a man in his early 40s, bespectacled with a neatly trimmed beard and a thoughtful air. "Miss Marple," he said, ushering her into his consultation room. "I've heard of your keen eye for detail. What can I do for you?" Miss Marple seated herself gently, smoothing her skirt. "I come as a concerned visitor, Doctor, about Nurse Ellis." Dr. Redcliffe's expression sobered immediately. "A great loss. I trained her myself when she returned to Chesham Vale. Very competent. Quiet, yes, but thoughtful. You signed for a bottle of chloral hydrate on her behalf some weeks ago?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I did. It was for a terminal patient she attended, Mr. Polkinghorne, a former postmaster. He passed away peacefully. The bottle was returned half-used." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "I've heard otherwise." Dr. Redcliffe's brow furrowed. "Mrs. Broom said the bottle wasn't among Maureen's things. She said no such bottle was ever found." He stood, moved to a small cabinet, and opened a drawer. From within, he withdrew a brown glass vial marked chloral hydrate. "This is what remains," he said. "She returned it 4 days before the incident." Miss Marple looked at the bottle with mild interest. "May I?" He passed it to her. She weighed it in her hand. "Still half full. She must have been careful with dosage." "She was," he replied. Miss Marple returned the bottle. "And did she mention being troubled? Anxious?" The doctor hesitated. "She came in once. I'd noticed weight loss, fatigue. She brushed it off, said she was just sleeping less lately. I pressed a little, and she admitted to stress. Family matters. I advised rest. She declined any sedatives." "Did she mention Stephen Ray?" A pause, a sigh. "Not by name, but I suspected something. Her eyes were always distant when I asked about personal matters. She was afraid. That's the impression I had." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear often leaves marks deeper than bruises." Dr. Redcliffe's shoulders tensed. "She had one," he said quietly. "A bruise. Inner arm, round shape like a grip. She said she'd knocked it on the bedpost. I didn't press." "You believed her?" Earl Grey by the window. From her vantage point, she watched the daily life of the village, the butcher's boy delivering paper parcels, a woman fussing over chrysanthemums, and, at last, a figure she had been waiting to see. Stephen Ray. He crossed the road with the restless gait of a man unused to stillness. Tall, broad-shouldered, clad in a worn leather jacket and dusty boots. His hair was uncombed, and he carried himself with the wary energy of a fox too long hunted. He disappeared into the Stag's Head, the local public house. Miss Marple waited 15 minutes before following. Inside, the pub was dimly lit and smelled of ale and wood polish. Stephen sat alone at a back table, nursing a pint and staring into it as if it might provide an answer to a question he dared not ask aloud. She took a seat near enough to observe, far enough not to be intrusive. She ordered a lemonade and listened. A local farmer tried to speak to him. Stephen shrugged him off. The barmaid offered a word of sympathy. Stephen muttered thanks but made no eye contact. When someone said, "Shame about Nurse Ellis," he froze. A long moment passed before he took another sip. It was not the grief that troubled Miss Marple, it was the silence. A young man in love, recently bereaved, might cry, might rage, might shout injustice, but Stephen was mute and too composed. Outside, as dusk fell and lamps blinked on across the village, Miss Marple walked the long way home, turning over what she'd observed. That night, in Edith Cranton's parlour, Clara the housekeeper passed on a new piece of gossip. "Did you hear?" she said breathlessly. "Little Rosie's boy, Timmy, you know him, says he saw Stephen Ray coming out of Maureen's cottage the night before she died, not by the front, round the back, said he was carrying something." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did he say what it was?" Clara shrugged. "Something small. Wrapped in a cloth? Might have been a book, might have been something else." "And the time?" "Late. Nearly 11, Timmy says. Said he was sneaking home after stealing plums and saw Stephen come out looking scared as a rabbit." Miss Marple gave a tiny, precise nod. "Children often see what grown-ups overlook." Clara nodded. "And Maureen's sister Lillian came into the post office yesterday. Asked the clerk if any post was missing from Monday. Said she was expecting something from Maureen." "Interesting," said Miss Marple. "Do you think Stephen did it?" Clara whispered. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "I think Stephen loved Maureen in a way that frightened her, and I think on the night she tried to break free, someone made sure she couldn't." Chapter 6. The Locked Drawer. Rain lashed Chesham Vale the next morning, tapping against windows and turning the cobbled lanes into streams of silver grey. Miss Marple sat in Edith Cranton's parlour with a shawl about her shoulders and a notebook open upon her lap. No names were written in it, just fragments of observations, tiny remarks and the sort of seemingly disconnected detail only she knew how to string into meaning. "Edith," she said gently, "do you remember the key you keep in the blue porcelain jar near the pantry?" Edith, startled mid-pour of tea, blinked. "Yes. Why, Jane?" "You told me once you gave Nurse Ellis permission to use that spare desk of yours, the one from your teaching days, the one with the old-fashioned drawer lock." "I did," said Edith slowly. She was between lodgings when she returned to the village, used the spare room for a fortnight. She'd jot her reports at the desk sometimes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think we might pay a visit to that desk." They made their way upstairs where the air held the faint scent of lavender polish and mothballs. The spare bedroom, unused since Maureen's stay, was still in tidy order. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains. The desk sat in the corner, walnut wood, its drawers locked and handles tarnished with age. Miss Marple picked up the porcelain jar and removed the brass key with care. It slid smoothly into the central drawer. With a soft click, the desk opened. Inside were the expected things, a few pens, some folded forms, a prescription pad. But tucked flat at the bottom of the drawer was a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly and marked in looping ink. "To be opened if anything happens to me?" Edith gasped. "Jane?" But Miss Marple was already lifting the letter with delicate fingers. They brought it downstairs. Edith paced the rug while Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, closely written in blue ink. Miss Marple read it aloud in her gentle, unwavering voice. "If this letter is found, it means I've been too afraid to do what I knew I should. Perhaps nothing will happen. But if it does, please understand that I was trying to do the right thing, even if it came too late. Stephen was kind to me once and I loved him. But lately he has been someone I don't recognize, angry, possessive. He told me if I left him, he would make sure I couldn't leave anyone else again. I don't know if he means it. But he's been watching me, even when I'm at the clinic. Last week, I found my diary had been rifled through. I burnt some pages. I was writing to someone, my aunt, in London. I asked her to help me get away. The letter was posted Monday night. If Stephen says it was an accident, please don't believe him. I cannot run away from this life, but I fear someone may help me leave it." There was silence when Miss Marple finished. Edith sat down slowly. "It's chilling." She feared him, Miss Marple said quietly. Feared him enough to write this, and yet not enough to leave at once. A sign, I think, of how deep the emotional trap was. "What do we do?" Edith asked. "We give it to Inspector Graves," Miss Marple replied, "and we visit the Rays' cottage first." Briar Hollow sat half forgotten on the edge of the village, where the trees grew wilder and the grass never quite behaved. The Ray home was a sagging structure, its garden overrun and its gate swinging on one hinge. Miss Marple knocked once, firmly. The door was answered by a woman with untidy hair and hollow eyes, Stephen's mother. "We aren't accepting guests," she said flatly. "I come with concern for your son," Miss Marple replied, "and I believe you know what it is like to lose someone in this house." Mrs. Ray hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of damp clothes and boiled onions. Stephen sat at the kitchen table, hunched, unshaven, and as still as a stone. "I told them everything," he muttered as Miss Marple entered. "She slipped. I wasn't even there." Miss Marple laid the letter on the table without a word. Stephen stared at it. His eyes did not move as he read. "I loved her," he said hoarsely. "They made her ashamed of me." "But she was frightened," Miss Marple said gently. "And when people are frightened, Stephen, they sometimes make decisions they wouldn't otherwise, like writing letters, like asking for help." His hands clenched on the table. "She said she wouldn't leave me." "She changed her mind," Miss Marple said, "and I think you knew that." He stood abruptly, the chair scraped backwards. "She was going to London with her aunt. I found the envelope before she posted it. She said she wasn't sure anymore, but I could tell she was lying. I begged her, and she said no." "Did you drug her?" Miss Marple asked softly. Stephen turned. "What?" "You were seen leaving her cottage that night," Miss Marple continued. "A village boy saw you. You took something with you, something small, wrapped in cloth, perhaps her diary or a bottle." Stephen's face contorted. "I didn't mean to hurt her." Miss Marple took a step closer. "What did you give her?" He crumbled into the chair. "Just enough to make her sleep, to stop her leaving. I was going to talk to her in the morning, make her see, but when I came back..." He looked up, eyes hollow. She was dead. Miss Marple left the house an hour later, with the letter in hand and a weary heart. At the police station, Inspector Graves took the document with a grim nod. "We'll hold him tonight. He'll be charged before the end of the week." Outside, rain had returned in a gentle mist, draping the village in veils of silver. Miss Marple stood beneath her umbrella and watched as the last threads of the illusion unravelled, a young woman's heart torn between fear and loyalty, A young man's desperation turned dangerous, a family's cold pride, and the quiet village that had seen it all but said nothing. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her pace steady and mind heavy. She knew the final chapter was close, but she also knew that truth, like a rose in winter, only bloomed when the thorns were cleared. Chapter 7. A dose too far. The following morning dawned sharp and still, as if the village of Chesham Vale had held its breath overnight. Word had already begun to spread. Stephen Ray had been arrested. But the story remained fragmented in the mouths of villagers, an accident, a confession, a sedative. Depending on whom one asked, Stephen was either a monster or a heartbroken fool. Miss Marple, having already delivered her statement to Inspector Graves, turned her attention back to the details. Not just Stephen's confession, but what it didn't explain. Something still sat uneasily in her mind. It was the matter of the chloral hydrate. At the Crescent tea rooms, where she took her mid-morning refreshment, Miss Marple found herself joined unexpectedly by young Millie Cartwright, the postmistress's daughter, and Mrs. Broom, Maureen's landlady. Both arrived looking flushed, as if news clung to them like pollen. "Mum says the police searched Stephen's room," Millie whispered. "But they didn't find the letter. The one Maureen posted. Not in his house and not anywhere. And not her diary either," Mrs. Broom added, wringing her hands. "And what about the bottle of sedative? I still say that's what did it." Miss Marple nodded, thoughtful. Yes, a powerful sedative, given in too high a dose, could have made her lose balance, or worse. But if Stephen didn't have the diary, well, who did? Mrs. Broom frowned. "The Ellis family came to fetch Maureen's things on Thursday. Her sister and mother took boxes, wouldn't let me help." Millie's eyes widened. "Do you think they—" Miss Marple stood, placing her napkin neatly on the table. "I think we've asked enough of poor Stephen Ray. Now it's time we spoke to someone else." That afternoon, with the sun beginning to warm the village rooftops, Miss Marple walked calmly to the Ellis home on Ashford Lane. This time, Lillian answered with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said, "I suppose you're here about Stephen." "Among other things," Miss Marple replied. She was led to the parlour, where Jean Ellis sat by the window in a hard-backed chair, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap. The boxes containing Maureen's belongings were stacked near the hearth. Miss Marple looked directly at Lillian. "Did you find her diary?" Lillian blinked. Yes, we took it. Mother didn't want strangers sifting through her private thoughts." Miss Marple gave a polite nod. "Then I must ask, did you read it?" Jean's voice cut across the room like a blade. "We did, and you'll find no mention of Stephen hurting her, not once." Miss Marple tilted her head. "No mention at all?" "Only that she felt trapped, that she feared disappointing us," Jean said firmly. Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "You know, I once had a niece who told me she was afraid of disappointing us. She was 5 years into a marriage that bruised her both inside and out. We later found pages of her diary had been torn out." Jean's lips thinned. "Maureen was dramatic." "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "She was desperate." She turned to Lillian. "Your sister posted a letter the night before she died, but it never reached its destination. Someone took it from the village box. Did you intercept it?" Lillian stiffened. "How dare you? Only someone with access to the key could have done it. You visited the post office the next morning, asking after it." "She was my sister," Lillian hissed. "You don't understand what she was doing. She was going to run off, ruin the family's name." Jean stood. "We tried to protect her from herself." "You tried to control her," Miss Marple said evenly. There was a moment of silence, thick as steam. Then Miss Marple took a folded note from her bag, the letter found in the locked desk. Jean Ellis read it with colour draining from her face. Lillian paled. Neither spoke. "Stephen gave her the drug, yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "But he says he only meant to make her sleep. Perhaps that's true, but the dose was too high. That was no accident. And someone made sure the truth never came to light." Lillian swallowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, eyes fixed on her, "that you found her before anyone else, that you discovered she'd written that letter, that you took her diary, burned the pages that damned you, and made it look like a clumsy fall, that maybe, just maybe, you increased the dose." "That's not—" Lillian's voice caught. Jean grabbed her daughter's hand. "Say nothing." Miss Marple's voice softened. "She was your sister, Lillian, but you didn't protect her, you silenced her." Lillian trembled. "I only wanted her to listen. She wouldn't listen to me. She was going to marry him. He would have destroyed her. I just wanted her to stop." Jean spoke sharply. "You've said enough."
"No," Lillian said, suddenly breathless. "No, Mother, I can't live with it. I put the bottle back, I burned the letter, I tore out the pages, but I didn't think she'd die. I thought she'd sleep, like Stephen said. I didn't think—" Jean stood and reached for her. "Lillian!" But Miss Marple stepped between them. "I'll call Inspector Graves," she said. "It's over now." That evening, the village was unnaturally quiet. In Mrs. Cranton's parlour, Miss Marple sipped her tea and stared out at the lane, bathed in golden twilight. Clara fussed in the kitchen, and Pickles snored softly beneath the table. Edith entered with the evening paper. "So it was the sister all along?" "No," Miss Marple said. "It was everyone. The mother's pride, the sister's envy, Stephen's desperation, and the village's silence. They all helped kill Maureen Ellis. Only one administered the dose, but many helped mix it." Edith sat beside her. "And Maureen?" She tried to fight back. In the end, she left just enough behind. Miss Marple set her teacup down. "You know, Edith, the dead always speak, if we care to listen."
Final item, Chapter 8. Miss Marple speaks. The villagers of Chesham Vale were not unfamiliar with scandal. Most had lived through wars, bankruptcies, affairs, and one particularly ugly flower show dispute in 1937. But the tragedy surrounding Nurse Maureen Ellis had cast a longer, darker shadow than most. By the end of the week, Inspector Graves had quietly taken Lillian Ellis into custody. Her mother, Jean, refused to make a statement, and had reportedly gone to stay with a cousin in Eastbourne, leaving her garden to wilt and her neighbours to gossip. Stephen Ray remained in the county jail for the moment, pending charges related to Maureen's death, though, as Miss Marple well knew, his role had now become a piece in a far larger puzzle. It was with this backdrop of unease and half-truths that Miss Marple suggested a final gathering. She wrote small, handwritten invitations, signed with her name in neat, cursive letters, and sent them by hand via Clara and Pickle. They were delivered to the people who had known Maureen best, or rather believed they had. By Saturday evening, the sun low and the wind mild, the drawing room of Mrs. Edith Cranton's house was full. Attendees: Inspector Graves, upright, moustached and patient; Dr. Redcliffe, arms folded, watching quietly; Frances Hargreaves, matron from the clinic, pale and composed; Mrs. Broom, the landlady, with a lace handkerchief clenched in her palm; Stephen Ray, freshly released, face hollow but gaze direct; and lastly, young Millie Cartwright, sitting beside her mother, eyes wide but brave. Miss Marple, in her favourite blue cardigan, took her usual seat near the hearth and folded her hands calmly. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know this has been a difficult time for Chesham Vale. But before we move on, I believe we owe Nurse Ellis something far more precious than our sympathy. We owe her the truth." There was a rustle of movement. Dr. Redcliffe gave a nod. Stephen stared into the fire. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "there are many ways to kill a person. Not all of them are sudden or even intentional. Sometimes death is like a slow knitting, a series of small threads drawn tighter until breath itself cannot escape." She looked at Stephen. "You loved Maureen, Mr. Ray, I believe that. But your love became something else, something Maureen feared. You tried to control her. You admitted as much." Stephen swallowed. "I just wanted her to stay." "You gave her a sedative," Miss Marple said gently. "You claimed it was only to make her sleep, but the dosage was far too high for that." He hesitated. "I didn't know. I thought just a few drops." "But someone else added to it," Miss Marple interrupted. "Didn't they?" Murmurs passed through the room. "I believe Maureen's sister, Lillian, discovered your plan. Whether she found the bottle you'd left or simply acted out of fear, she increased the dose, thinking perhaps that a deeper sleep would keep Maureen from escaping, or from telling the truth." Dr. Redcliffe leaned forward. "You believe Lillian tampered with it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and she said as much when pressed. She intercepted the letter Maureen posted to her aunt in London. She burned pages from Maureen's diary, pages that might have revealed more than bruises. And she left the scene that night believing she had delayed her sister's departure, not ended her life." Frances Hargreaves spoke softly. "She always hated Maureen being more admired. She once told me Maureen got everything handed to her." "But it wasn't true." "No," said Miss Marple. "Maureen worked hard. She carried burdens no one saw. A proud mother who disapproved of her choices, a possessive lover, a jealous sister, and a village that turned its face away." Mrs. Broom gave a small sob. Millie Cartwright raised her hand timidly. "Is that why she wrote the letter?" "Yes, dear," said Miss Marple gently. Maureen was trying to leave, to ask for help. She feared what might happen if she stayed, and she feared that no one would believe her. The room fell silent. "Fortunately," Miss Marple went on, "she left us one final clue, the letter in the locked desk, the bruise on her arm, the chair by the hearth, the missing diary, the witnesses, like you, Millie, and you, Mrs. Broom, who remembered small things no one else did. The truth was always there." Inspector Graves spoke at last. "With Lillian's confession and the corroborating evidence, I believe the Crown Prosecution Service will pursue a charge of manslaughter. And as for Stephen Ray," Miss Marple raised a hand. "Let me say one final thing, Inspector. Mr. Ray is not innocent. He may not have set out to kill her, but he manipulated her, trapped her in fear. A good man does not drug the woman he claims to love." Stephen bowed his head. "I never wanted her dead." "No," Miss Marple said, "but wanting isn't the same as caring. And she died afraid of you." Tears slipped down his cheek. Miss Marple turned to the others. "Let Maureen be remembered not as a nurse who slipped by the fire, but as a young woman who tried, against great pressure, to reclaim her life. That's what she deserved." Inspector Graves stood. "Miss Marple, I don't know how you do it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I don't do anything, Inspector. I merely listen." Later that evening, after everyone had left and Edith Cranton had gone to bed, Miss Marple sat quietly beside the drawing-room window. The sky was deep blue, and stars had begun to blink into view. She looked down at her lap where her knitting rested, a simple scarf in soft grey wool. As her fingers moved with mechanical precision, her thoughts wandered not to justice or police reports, but to Maureen Ellis, the quiet girl with the tired eyes, the steady hands, the whisper of lavender that lingered in the desk upstairs. "I hope," Miss Marple whispered aloud, "that wherever you are, your silence has ended." And with that, she returned to her knitting, one thread at a time, just as she always had, knowing that the world's cruelties could be untangled if one only had the patience to trace each knot to its root.